As I indicated this morning, I'm not so sure this is a keynote. This is more of my thought processes rather than keynote. As I indicated this morning, I do believe that documentation is key or central to the work we do, particularly in conservation and in managing cultural heritage. And this is something which I will try and emphasize as I go along in my presentation. I would also want to give you a glimpse of what ICCROM is doing, not all the ICCROM programs, but some of the important ones which I think could be relevant to what we are doing. Because we have discussed, and I'm sure we are going to discuss a lot about issues in conflict areas and also technology application, I have tried to shy away from those areas because I think we will have sufficient discussion. But I thought I should start by reminding everyone that whilst conflict is catastrophic and perhaps immediate to us, there are also other disasters or other issues which affect archaeological heritage. And particularly now with climate change, I think we have issues which we should not forget that this affects archaeological sites, perhaps not in this region, but in other regions of the world. We have conditions which we are not used to, and these are affecting archaeological sites everywhere. And at times it's hurricanes, at times it's floods, and archaeological sites, generally speaking, tend to suffer. Particularly, I think we are all aware of the practice of archaeologists. When they excavate, the last thing in their mind is conservation. The first thing is information. They want to get information, and at times they leave these sites open, and that creates a lot of problems. Some other natural disasters, earthquakes, again, probably in the same mold as conflict, we do have impact on this. And of course, there's the natural impact on archaeological sites, which I'm just trying to remind you that these things exist outside the other dramatic issues which we will always look at. But I think it's important to realize that documentation is not just required because the site is in a conflict zone, but that documentation must also take place throughout, even in our general general upkeep of sites, and make sure that we understand what is going on. Of course, there are other issues which affect the way we look at sites. The lack of economic means to look after our heritage, I think it's something which we tend to forget and think that it's easy to do that. I would also say that lack of capacity and skills. Again, this is something which I don't want to say that it is just the experts. It is important that we also make sure that issues like documentation are also done by others who are not experts, particularly when we start talking about conflict areas, and I think I will allude to this later. Urban unrest, in some urban areas, I'm told, they resemble war zones in terms of the impact on archaeological sites. And this is something which we tend to forget because war is dramatic. We tend to rush there and say, okay, heritage is in danger. But in urban environments, the danger is always there. And the danger is always there in the sense of lack of planning. We do not plan for it, and that in itself can lead to disasters. There is also the impact of development. I think of all people we know the Nubian campaign. That was one of the first signals to indicate to us that development is not just something which perhaps improves the lives of communities, but it also destroys archaeological sites. And one of my regrets all the time, and Zaki is talking about Sudan and the work we are going to do in Sudan, one of the things which hit me when I went to Sudan was the number of archaeological artifacts and monuments which we rescued during the 1960s, which is now decaying in storerooms and warehouses, and for us to rescue it in the name of saving heritage and just to dump it and for it to rot somewhere else, I thought that was something which, as archaeologists, as conservators, it should prick our conscience. I'm not so sure whether it wouldn't have been better if it was flooded in some cases. I don't know how many of you have been to Sudan, and if they're open to you, there are museums and all this. You feel, this pain that the world came to the rescue, but at the same time, what did we do after that? And this is the danger with dramatic events where we go in, we document, we try and serve, but then the next thing is, once the conflict or the danger is gone, we neglect what we have done. And I think this is something which we need to try and avoid. Of course, a war, we have already been told, is very catastrophic. It leads to destruction. Zaki's presentation indicates that, and I'm just showing you here some of the photographs he has already shown you. But this, again, emphasizes the need for documentation during the conflict, but it would have been better if the documentation was done before. But generally speaking, we don't do that. But as a management issue, I think this is important. Once it's done, once war comes, it's important to document what is happening. It's important to also monitor what is happening. Again, just want to say that documentation is key to our work. For us to understand the processes, whether it's conflict processes, whether it's the natural decay of things as they go by, or just understanding the material conditions, the composition of the material and how it reacts to different things, again, it is important for us to document. It is important to document also because it gives us the genesis of the problem. It gives us the indication of what we can do in time. Again, I want to say that there is a lot of documentation which goes on, but unless it is used, I think it's almost pointless in some cases. We need to be able to make sure that it is a continuous documentation process. It is a continuous record rather than something which we do and we forget about it. Of course, monitoring is also a key to documentation. If we can look at different periods and be able to compare, or even with new technologies these days, you can actually be able to see what is documentation. So my point is that we must be able to integrate documentation into into the management processes at all levels. The other issue which I want to emphasize is the issue of broadening the role players of documentation. It is not just the experts, it is also the community. Because what is your archaeological site could also be somebody's grazing land, or as I have called it in the discussion on Great Zimbabwe, it could be somebody's shrine, and you are only looking at it from an archaeological point of view. And yet, you could also get someone to look after it from a different angle, because they respect that place, not because of its scientific information, but because of probably religious information. Again, another good example is the city where I'm living now, Rome. The ruins are part and parcel of the townscape, and it is daily lives that you see these ruins everywhere. Unless you involve the population in the conservation and documentation of it, you might actually find that you are fighting a losing battle as a professional because the community doesn't understand what you're trying to do. It is important that documentation also encompasses or it includes the community. And today, with technology, I think these things are important and they can be done. Again, I'm just emphasizing here that responsibility for cultural heritage and the management of it belongs, in the first place, to the cultural community that has generated it. I would even go further, not just those who have generated it, but those who live around it and those who have something to do with that cultural heritage. It could be economic, it could be religious, it could be somebody's grazing land, or it could just be a playground for kids. But again, we cannot just privilege archaeological heritage and ignore the other dimensions to that. I'm not going to go into details about use of satellite technology. I'm sure we'll have a lot of examples to look at. The 3D technologies, which we are now familiar with, the mobile phones and how we can document and things like that. The good thing about the mobile phone technology is that it is accessible to almost everybody. Even in a country, in a continent like Africa, you will be amazed by the number of smartphones. Even the headman, the person who looks after cattle, they have the latest smartphone. How they get it, I don't know. So, but the most important thing is this is a tool for us. We can make these people help us to document heritage. It can help us to get more information on how we can manage the heritage. And again, smartphones are packed with a lot of things which some of us are not even aware of and cannot utilize. Let me come back to ICCROM. The important thing about our mission statement is that ICCROM has to provide the knowledge, the tools, and the enabling environment to its member states. And that includes providing these in terms of documentation, in terms of management. And of course, ICCROM cannot do that on its own. We have to do it with all of you. And with your help, we may be able to provide the best documentation technology available. And the best does not mean the most expensive. It could be the cheapest. And I think the cheaper it is, the better. ICCROM focuses on three main strategic directions. The first one is focusing on world concerns for cultural heritage, basically what the world is concerned about. Today we talk of conflict, but I would also say that for ICCROM there's also the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN, which we need to be able to articulate in terms of the way we work. We also need to create a diverse and inclusive global network. In other words, we need to include all the regions. So far, we have work going on here in the Mana region. I think we are very satisfied as ICCROM with what is going on and your partnership and all that. But we also have other regions where we feel we need to begin to pay attention. And in the next 4 years, the two regions where we think we should also emphasize is Latin America and Africa. And these can benefit a great deal from the work which you are already doing here to make sure that they also are not left behind in what is happening in the heritage field. And of course, the third one is strengthening and transforming ICCROM for the future, so that ICCROM does not just remain an old organization, but it also embraces new technologies it embraces new thinking, and it is in line with similar organizations like the UN and so forth. I've mentioned ICCROM's commitment to the Sustainable Development Goals. We believe that this should guide us in our work. We need to contribute to them. And we have chosen a few of these SDGs, not because of anything, but we also want to make sure that we contribute to the main ones where we can. Of course, we can contribute to all of them, but this might be not the target. We have targeted at least 3 of them to make sure that we can do that. For example, if we target SDG 1, which is alleviating poverty, I think as heritage professionals, we'll be setting ourselves for failure. So we want SDGs where we can actually contribute. And SDG 11, sustainable cities and communities, is something which we have targeted. And it also, 11.4, talks about cultural heritage and how we can improve that. And that's something which we have said we will look at and try and work around that. It involves also the issues which we are going to be dealing with, conflict and documentation and so forth. And how do we look at that? The other SDG which we have isolated is SDG 8, I think it's 8.7, creating work opportunities through cultural heritage, particularly in ensuring traditional crafts and also sustainable tourism and issues like that. This is something which we think we can perhaps achieve. SDG 16, which talks about peace, justice, and strong institutions. This talks to identity. This talks to expressions of cultural beliefs, of cultural diversity, and issues like that. And we believe that this is something which we can perhaps be able to contribute. The return of cultural property to areas of origin strengthens identity, strengthens individual nations, and this is something which I think ICCROM can play a part together with our partners in this case. But however, one of the programs where I think resonates with what you are going to be doing is one of our flagship programs. We've got about 3 flagship programs which we are going to be emphasizing in the next 4 to 6 years. And the first and far most important program is the first aid to cultural heritage in times of crisis. And this is a project or a program which we have been working on for some time now, and we feel that it is something which is needed in the world, and we will continue working on it. And Zaki's center is already implementing some of these issues. And again, the issue is culture cannot wait. We cannot say that we just want to save lives and then culture later. Yes, of course, life is important. But then if we just save life and we don't save culture, what happens then next? How do we actually rebuild communities if we have lost the cultural fiber? So this is something which we are rolling out, and we will continue to make sure that we try and roll out programs. I think so far we are almost doing 4 to 6 projects a year in order to make sure that we improve the situation in times of crisis. Again, in some places we've just done a course in Mali, which finished a week ago. And again, we try to bring people from different parts of the world, not just Africans, but we had people from Colombia attending, because these problems might look like they are African problems, but we can experience them elsewhere. It might look like they are the Arab region problems, but in actual fact, you can find them elsewhere. But the whole issue about this first aid to cultural heritage is trying to make sure that we improve emergency preparedness, particularly in terms of saving cultural heritage. Of course, we have emergency services from other different groups, civil society, but we are trying to incorporate cultural heritage as one of the components in the civil service preparedness. Sorry. Apart from having partnerships with UNESCO, we also partner with even the police, particularly in Italy and places like that. And we try and design courses which also lead to creation of strong leadership in terms of implementing what we are doing. And I've already mentioned the fact that we try and work with other institutions. In this case, this course which took place in the Netherlands, and it was aimed at creating leadership at emergency situations. And it was not just attended by heritage professionals, but these were people who were already trained in civil society preparedness, but we give them the skills to look after the heritage as well. Now, I know that we all tend to look at conflict, again, as something which comes up from time to time, but there's another issue which has come up, particularly, I'm sure, in September. You may have been aware of the fire which destroyed the museum in Rio. This made ICCROM reflect on issues of fire. It was amazing how many museums, how many heritage institutions have been destroyed by fire, and yet we are not doing anything. And this is something which ICCROM has said, we need to look at how do we prevent fires destroying our heritage? How do we actually make sure that because again, one of the major issues with the Rio fire is that some of the heritage which was in that museum was not even documented because of lack of funds. Over the years, government has taken money out of the museum saying, well, culture can wait, we can do it at another time. The fire came, it destroyed everything before we could record it. So what we are saying is, as ICCROM, we need to prepare museums so that they are ready for these situations. It's not just Brazil. We can look at the number of fires here from London 2013, Moscow, New Delhi, Glasgow, Jakarta, and then the last one there. So it's something which is common, but for some reason we have tended to say, well, it just happened to this museum. And yet, these are supposed to be safe havens, museums, for our cultural heritage. And yet, we are not ready for something which I think preventing fire, if I recall, somebody was telling us, these are the escape doors when we came, right? You will be surprised that most of these museums don't have escape doors. They don't have fire extinguishers, or the fire extinguishers have never been tried or tested or whatever. But again, I think it's something which we need to do something about. The other program which we are putting forward, again, which has got a lot to do with documentation, is this one which links people, nature, and culture in heritage conservation. For some time, we have worked in silos. IUCN on its own, cultural organization, ICOMOS, ICCROM, UNESCO on their own. But I think there's quite a lot of common elements which we need to bring together. And this is one of the flagship programs which we are trying to, or which we are already putting into motion. And the whole idea, again, is to develop effective management, to make sure that we carry out impact assessments to see what are the risks which cultural heritage and natural heritage has, and get prepared in time. I'm not going to go into the programs of ATA as a region. I'm sure Zaki will be able to give you more information on this, but just to say that very much reflecting the programs of ICCROM at every stage, and he will probably do a good job of that. One of our important areas is the provision of knowledge or sharing information, particularly on cultural heritage. And over the years, of course, we have produced a number of books, a number of texts. A lot of them are on internet. Most of our books now basically are e-books rather than sort of paper books, so that people can have access to that. Zaki has also done a good job in translating some of these books so that they are accessible. I just wanted to mention the ICCROM archive as one of the pillars of our work, particularly if you're going to be doing documentation. It was very interesting when I came across this picture of the Burmese Buddha. If you recall, a few years ago it was destroyed, and this picture was taken in 1970. And when I compared it with the pictures which were taken just before the blast, and I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I could see, just by looking at the pictures, how much deterioration had gone on in less than 15 years. And this is something which we should be using our archives to try and see how we monitor things and what has happened. Again, I have that the stupa in Sri Lanka, the same thing. You can clearly see that certain things had deteriorated. It no longer looks like this. Of course, there have been additions and so forth. But making this information available to our member states is one of the key issues which we have to address, because not everyone has access to information which is here. I was also looking at, somebody mentioned Ethiopia, Lalibela and so forth. Some of the photographs which were taken in 1970s, 1960s, and how things have developed ever since and what happened there. I think it's important that we use our archives to try and get correct information, but also try and use our archives for monitoring and for planning purposes. This leads me to another important program for ICCROM, which is the Sounds and Image Conservation program. A lot of our information is digital, and it also needs to be conserved. And we have done a lot at training in the last few years in trying to train people to conserve digital information. It might look like it's yesterday, but unless we conserve it and make it available, we might actually lose it. The other program, which is interesting to note, which again does a lot of documentation, particularly within the museum side, is the REORG program, which again, in the last year, looked at 144 museums in over 30 countries. And the situation in most of the museums is the same. Some artifacts in the storeroom, no documentation. They were collected, and there's bare minimum information on it. We need to be looking at it and saying, how do we actually ensure that it is conserved? Understanding the material. This is also some of the courses ICCROM does. We look at paper conservation in Mexico and in Japan. I've already mentioned the sound and image. The stone course, which for the first time this year was done in Mexico. Again, trying to make sure that we understand the material which we use for conservation. I think I want to end by saying that given the number of conflicts not just here, but in the world, I think we need to find a way of how we can use heritage to silence the guns in these areas, because that is the best conservation method we can have. I know it's not easy, but perhaps how do we make sure that heritage is not a target, but it is a force for good to bring communities, to bring countries together? Shukran.